My paranormal experiences started when I was a child, roughly around 8 years old, and they have basically been occurring throughout my entire life. I'm 48 years old. I'm a teacher, and I also worked for 6 years in organ and tissue transplant, basically recovering organs and tissues from deceased donors. That's a little bit of background on myself. So my first experience with paranormal, I was 8 years old and we had a sleepover at my house. So I had my cousins sleeping over, and my cousin Jeanette woke me up around 2:30 in the morning. She basically told me to, stay awake while she went to the bathroom. And that's what I did. I sat up on the bed. I saw her go into the bathroom, and then I saw the door close. So at that moment, I turned back to look at the clock, and I saw that it was 2:30 a.m. So I turned back around to look at the doorway, and there was a lady standing in the doorway. It was like I want to say kind of like a fluorescent green. And you could see right through her. So it was kind of like her nightgown had that appearance, like that green, that fluorescent green. And at that instant, I fell back on the bed and was unable to move. So I saw her walk around, or I should say float around the bed, and I could not see anything above her neck. So I just saw, I would see her body and her hands. So she ended up stopping right above my head, and her hand started coming down to my forehead. And as it got closer, it turned from like a normal hand with flesh. It started turning into a like bone, like skeleton. And I remember it was about to touch me, and I just remember closing my eyes, and I yelled, I screamed for my cousin. So at that moment, she ran out of the bathroom, and I looked to where she was, and then I looked back, and that ghost wasn't there anymore. That kind of introduced me to the paranormal world. And my second experience, I was visiting my family. I had an aunt and uncle and some cousins that lived up in Houston. And I was visiting them with my brother and my grandmother. It was during summer. And one night, I remember, this was when I was around 12 years old. I started cussing at everybody. And I just remember that I was myself. I could see myself doing these things, but I was not in control. I was, basically kind of watching it in the third person. And I remember cussing at my grandmother and laughing, and my uncle and my aunt and my cousins, and just saying real nasty things. And they didn't know what was happening. I had never acted like that before. So during that incident, I remember seeing my grandmother start to pray her rosary. At the end of her rosary session, I kind of snapped out of it, and I was like back to my normal self. And I asked them, what happened? Because I had developed like immediate amnesia at that moment. So they told me what was happening, and I apologized, and kind of had a faint memory of it. But in any case, I apologized for whatever I did that hurt them. But the way they were describing it was that I had a kind of like a different look on my face when I was saying these things to them. So my grandmother asked me to sleep on the floor in her bedroom, and that's what I did. And so that night I was laying down on the floor, and I remember that. So there's a moment between light sleep and deep sleep, that little knife's edge between falling into deep sleep was where I was. And at that moment, right before I fell into deep sleep, I heard a voice inside my head, and it said goodbye. But it was the most evil sounding voice. And I didn't dream it. I didn't make it up because I remember opening my eyes and there was a window right in front of me. There was a shadow that was looking in. There was a shadow of a person that was looking in. And then I saw the shadow just run. Like it took off. And then a couple of seconds later, on the other side of the house, my cousin started screaming. So my uncle got up, he got his gun, and he ran outside because he thought, maybe there's a burglar or just somebody that's causing some problems. So he ran out. He couldn't find anybody. And then my cousin ended up telling me like, what had happened, that she saw somebody that was looking into her room and then took off running. And I told her, well, that's exactly what I saw. So I remember telling my grandmother what I heard. And she basically told me that, yeah, there was something inside you that took over and made you act the way you did. So when I realized that I was susceptible to paranormal experiences like that, my grandmother would always tell me that there was something about me that was very special, but also could be dangerous. And I never really understood what she meant up until that point where she told me that something had taken over me. And that really did scare me because I didn't want to have that happen again. The next experience, which ironically is like 4 years later, my first experience was at 8 years old. My second one was at 12. My third experience was when I was 16 years old. That incident, I was asleep. It was a Saturday morning. I was in school. I was in high school. And that Saturday morning, I had a dream, like an out of body experience to where I could see myself asleep on the bed, but I was dreaming, or maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. It was just a really weird dream. But in that dream, I saw 4 friends of mine that were inside my room. And mind you, I could only see from their waist up. I could not see their legs. But I remember seeing them talking and joking amongst themselves. I couldn't hear what they were talking about or what they were saying. But at the same time, they all poked me in my knee. So at that moment that they all poked me in my knee in the dream, I woke up and I had completely lost the memory of that dream or that incident. So when I woke up, I was looking inside my room I thought maybe it was a cat that was inside my room and jumped up on the bed, but there was nobody there. My brother wasn't there. The door was closed. It was just myself in the room. And so I didn't pay no mind. I started, I laid back down and I started falling back asleep. Right as I was just about to fall into deep sleep, my mom knocks on my bedroom door and she comes in with the house phone and she goes, "Hey, it's your cousin Gabby." And I thought it was kind of weird because, he's calling on a Saturday morning at 9 a.m. Like it didn't make sense. So I got the phone and I'm like, "Hey, what's up?" And I asked him, I go, "Why are you calling so early?" And he was like, "Hey, did you hear what happened last night?" And I was like, "No, I didn't." I go, "I stayed home last night. I didn't do anything." And he was like, "Well, last night, there were some races north of our city, some races that they would do out in the country, classic cars and, race cars." And he was like, "Mando, Marlise, Jesse, and Letty died last night." And I was like, "What? Like, what do you mean?" I go, "If you're joking, you need to stop joking right now because it's too early in the morning." And his voice started cracking like he wanted to cry. And when I heard that, immediately after hearing his voice crack, I remembered that I had just seen all 4 of them in my dream. And there was no way for me to know that they had died the night before because I did not go out. I did not speak to any of my friends or mutual friends. Like I didn't speak to anybody, but they ended up visiting me that night or in my dream that morning. And that was like, that to this day still doesn't make sense. I don't know how that happened or how they came to me in my dream, but yeah, I still think about that every day. The next experience that I can remember, this was, yeah, like, when I got married at age 30, we moved into a house. It was, my wife's parents' house. I had some dogs, some really nice cane corso dogs that we kept them outside. And the house, there was something about the house that every time you walked in, there was a heavy feeling inside the hallway. And, it wouldn't go away. So I remember my dad at that time, he was alive. He brought over a Bible and he started praying inside the house. And he asked me to open the back door and the front door because he wanted to pray, and if there was anything there, that would go out. So I remember that I was standing in the hallway, and my dad was walking up and down the house praying in each room, and I remember feeling this wall of ice that would travel from the front of the house, passing right through my body as it traveled to the back of the house. And then it will come back and pass right through me and go to the front. And eventually after like 5 or 10 minutes, it left. But when that was happening to my body, it was like a bone chilling cold sensation throughout every bone in my body. You could feel something in the air that was heavy and it was not good. It was evil. Shortly after that experience, I was in bed, sleeping, and my wife was next to me. It must have been around 3 a.m. I remember waking up. I opened my eyes and I saw a girl standing next to my bed, and she was looking down at me, but I couldn't see her face because her hair was draped down in front of her face. I thought it was my wife. So I really didn't think nothing of it. And I was just wondering, why is she standing there looking at me? But then at that moment, I felt my wife next to me. She turned over because, she was sleeping. And I was like, oh my God, it's not her. So then who is it? And I panicked. It could have been sleep paralysis, but I don't think it was. I think it was a spirit that was there. And I just remember I closed my eyes and started praying. And a few seconds after I started praying, I opened my eyes and she wasn't there anymore. The next day after that, we woke up around 7:30 in the morning to my dog barking like a maniac outside at the back door. So we both got up and we're like, what's going on? We thought somebody was in the yard. So I opened the back door, and I saw my dog. His name was Hickson. He was just barking like a madman or a mad dog. And he was just staring at the wall. He was staring at the wall, leading to the back door entrance. And I was like, what's wrong with you? And he wouldn't listen to me. He just kept staring at the wall. So I looked and I'm like, well, what are you looking at? Is it a bug or something? No, it wasn't a bug. It was a faint drawing of some sort of what looked like occult symbols that somebody had drawn on the brick. It's very strange symbols. And he was just barking, and he had this look, and he was growling. It was very, very weird. I ended up taking a brush and some water and basically just washed it out of the brick. And, it never happened again, but it just made me think, like, is there something in here that is evil? So I asked my mother-in-law about it, and I told her some of the experiences that I had in the house, including my son, because my son had been born in 2004, and it never failed that at 7 a.m. and at 7 p.m, he would start crying like he was in severe pain, and it would just happen like clockwork. every morning and every night at 7. So after my father did his prayer thing in the house, well, he had stopped crying. So that was a good thing. That was a positive thing. But, of course, there was still a couple of paranormal incidents that occurred after that. The wall of ice that I felt in my house, I had experienced that when I lived in another city and was going to college. I was living by myself, and I must have been 23, 24 years old, living in my own apartment. And I remember I woke up because it was hot inside my apartment, and I walked from the bedroom through the living room into the kitchen where the thermometer was, the wall thermometer. And I remember as I was passing through the living room, I felt like I had just passed through a wall of ice. It made me start trembling and shaking. So I remember I turned down the temperature just a little bit, probably like 78. So it wasn't cold. It wasn't cold at all. But I remember walking back and I climbed into bed and I could not stop shaking and trembling. Like I was cold. And I remember for about an hour, I felt like that. And it started worrying me because I couldn't stop shaking. Eventually I did stop, but that had never happened in my life. And I was like, well, maybe it's the flu or maybe it's a stomach bug, but no. I remember distinctly the moment that I passed through that ice wall and got on the other side. And then when I came back, I passed through it again and I went into bed, after adjusting the temperature. Like I said, all my life I've had these weird experiences that I can't explain. It culminated in 2014 when my father ended up passing away after a long battle with cancer. He passed away in April. Shortly after, probably about 3 days after he passed away, at my parents' house, the doorbell would start ringing every day at 7 a.m. and at 7 p.m. And it did not fail. For 2 weeks, the doorbell would ring at 7 a.m. and then at 7 p.m. And we started suspecting that it's probably our dad that is doing this. And, we would ask, of course, we would talk out loud and ask if it was him. We would never get any auditory confirmation, but you could smell and you could feel a warm presence in the house. And I remember one time I was walking from the bathroom into the living room and I was passing through the kitchen and I felt a warm embrace and I stopped. I stopped in my tracks and I could smell my father. I could smell his scent and I felt the warmth of his embrace and I started crying and I told him, Dad, if it's you, I love you and I miss you. And, I hope to see you one day soon. And that was it. So a couple of days later, the doorbell stopped ringing. We could never figure out how and why it would ring. Well, one of my mom's cousins, who is an electrician, went over to check to see if there was an electrical short that was causing it to happen. And he found nothing wrong with it. So the only thing I can think of is that it was my father kind of letting us know that he was still there. When he passed away, I remember 2 years before, I was by his side when the doctor first mentioned the word cancer. And I told him that day, that moment that we heard cancer, I told him, Dad, I'm going to be with you through it all. I'm never going to leave your side. And that's the promise that I made to him. And that's a promise that I kept. I was always with him. And to see a man that was, your hero and your dad and everything to you go from a healthy looking person to a shell of his former self, wasted away by the cancer. It changed me, I don't even want to say devastated because that's not even the word. it pales in comparison to that word. It was a life-changing experience because the loss that I experienced and to my family, he was the kind of the glue that held all the family together, the extended family and the immediate family. He was a very special person. So when he passed away, it kind of like fragmented the family unity, and we've never been able to regain it since he passed away. But anyways, that August, August 2014, I was with my girlfriend and I had slept over with her. I remember that I dreamt that I was sitting on a dock in the middle of a bay or water. It was like a very calm ocean or bay. I'm not sure which one it was, but I was sitting on a dock at night, and I remember I was crying because I was missing my dad. At that moment, I turned around to look behind me, and I saw a boathouse or a house that was in the water, and there was a light that had turned on inside, and I could see it through the windows. So I turned back around and I just kept crying because I was really missing my dad. And then I heard somebody start walking towards me slowly. You could hear the footsteps. And I just remember feeling a hand on my left shoulder. And I look up and it's my dad. And he told me, he goes, "Happy birthday, mijo." And man, I woke up, right after that, and I was crying. It surprised me. It shocked me that he visited me in my dream because that was my birthday. Like that day was when I turned, 1 year older than what I was. But, it was a very, nice experience. But at the same time, it made me start questioning why these things were happening to me. Of course, I didn't regret it. I didn't regret seeing him and talking to him again, but it just made me miss him more. And I started questioning, am I ever going to see him again? Am I ever going to see my loved ones again? And that was a question that to this day, it still stays in my mind. So during that time in 2014, from 2004 through 2016, I worked as a hospital pharmacy technician. There was some paranormal stuff that happened in the pharmacy there because the hospital was a very old pharmacy. And I remember there was one time, it was about 6 a.m. in shift change. And I was working out in the front where the medication tablets and the pills were. And the IV technician was back in the IV lab. And it was very quiet. It was just me and her working there. Nobody else had shown up, and the night crew had already left. So I'm there, I'm on the computer, just printing out some reports. And her name was Miriam. She comes back to where I was, and she's over here. She's looking around, to the left, to the right, and she's going through all the aisles. And I'm like, "Hey, what's up? Like, who are you looking for?" And she was like, she didn't say nothing. She went back to the Ivy lab, and about a minute later, she comes back, and I saw her enter the clinical pharmacy area, and then she comes back to the front again, and she's looking. I'm like, "Hey, what are you looking for?" And she was like, did anybody else show up right now?" I'm like, "No, like it's just me and you right now." I go, "Frank, the pharmacist, he's running late. So yeah, it's just me and you." And she was like, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's just me and you." She was like, "Did anybody bring their kid this morning?" And I'm like, "No, again, it's just me and you." And her face just turned pale. And she was like, "I just saw a kid right now enter from the back. It was a little boy, probably around 4 or 5 years old." She was like, "I saw him walk in. He walked towards your area." And I'm like, "No, like I didn't see anything." And she was the type of person that didn't joke around, too much. And she was very honest and matter of fact. I don't remember her ever making something up like that. So when I saw her turn pale, I knew that she was telling the truth. Another incident that happened in the pharmacy is I was working, printing out some reports in the clinical pharmacy area, and I was walking to the front dispensing area, and there was a table where we would package all the medication. And I remember I left a pencil on that table. So as I was coming around the corner, I looked up because I was going to grab the pencil, and I was probably around 6 feet away from the table. And I saw that pencil like if somebody hit it, and it flew off the table, and nobody else was there around me or the table. And I remember, like, I was freaked out. I'm like, that thing just flew off the table. It was not wind. It wasn't somebody like a real person. I go, there was something that hit it. Was it scary? No, it was just kind of more like, wow, like I can't believe I saw that. And I would also hear stories about in the Ivy lab, the IV bags that they would stock, they would fly off the shelves. And I saw that happen a couple of times, but it wasn't, to me, it wasn't scary. Like I didn't, I wasn't scared about it. That was interesting. That was some interesting times. The real, scary incidents happened after I entered the organ and tissue transplant field. My main role was being a supervisor in in the team that I was leading. So it was me and like two or three other people, and we covered half the state of Texas. So anytime there was somebody that passed away and they were a organ or tissue donor, we would go out to that location, perform the surgeries to surgically recover their eyes, their corneas from the eyes, the bones, pretty much all the bones from the body except the spinal column, the heart, the femoral and saphenous veins from the legs, and the skin. So we would literally take the skin from the legs, from the hip all the way down to the ankle, and also the skin from the back and the skin from the abdominal area. So it was like, to me, it was fascinating to do that job, but I ended up working two jobs. So one of the jobs that I had was working for the eye bank, recovering corneas, and the other one was working for the tissue harvesting company. And those two jobs basically were hand in hand. So anytime there was a donor, I would recover the corneas for the eye bank and then also recover the tissues for the tissue bank. It was good money. We were so busy that I was losing sleep, to the extent that it was very common to, like, every week I would go 2 to 4 days with no sleep because we were always traveling. We would travel between 3 to 6 hours from home and just be on the road, doing these surgeries from Corpus Christi to Laredo, San Antonio, all the way down to the Rio Grande Valley, wherever there was a surgery, that's where we would go. The sleep deprivation, it wasn't too bad. I was young enough to where I could hack it. I could handle it. But the first paranormal experience I had from that job was that particular morning. I wasn't on call with the tissue bank, but I was on call with the cornea bank, with the eye bank. And they called me out to a cornea recovery at a city near my hometown. So I went and I walked into the OR, the operating room, and I saw my coworkers in there, the tissue team. So, we were joking and laughing, like we were in a good mood. I remember I had to do a physical assessment on the body and the eyes. And I remember when I opened his eyes to do a visual inspection of his eyes, the first thing that I noticed was he had this look in his eyes of anger, like he was dead, but you could still see there was something in him that was trapped. Like he had wanted to come out and he was angry. So I asked the team leader of the tissue team, I asked him, hey, what's the backstory on this guy? And the story was that he was a very, abusive husband and truck driver that also would do a lot of cocaine and alcohol. The story was that 3 days before he passed away, he developed a nosebleed at home. He had just come back from a 2 week trip driving his 18 wheeler all over the nation. He got home and, he was partying, he was barbecuing, but he was also doing cocaine and alcohol. So he developed a nosebleed and his wife, asked him to go to the emergency room and he refused. He said, "Oh, it's nothing. Don't worry about it." That night that he ended up going to the emergency room and passing away, it turned from just a nosebleed to like a sort of reddish pink foam that started coming out. At that time, when it got more serious, yeah, he went to the emergency room, and within 1 hour, they told me that he died. He just had a cardiac arrest and he died. So I ended up recovering his corneas, but I left. I felt this heaviness inside me as I left, and I wasn't happy anymore. I was like, something was weighing me down, and I got in my car to go ship the corneas out, and I started like tearing up and crying, and I didn't know why I was doing that. Like, it was weird. And for the next 3 days, I remember feeling like that, like something had attached to me and was weighing me down. And I was praying real hard and asking God to, help take this, whatever spirit that had latched onto me, take it away. And eventually it went away, but that was my first paranormal experience in the organ and tissue field. Another experience during that time was, I was recovering some tendons from the legs along with my coworker. And, we were talking, we were very professional about the job. I remember we were talking about fishing or hunting, something like that. But, we were focused on work and, just chit chatting. The next thing I know, there was a piece of muscle that I had cut from his calf because I had to get to the Achilles tendon to harvest it. And he and I saw that piece of tissue roll up his femur. And there was no way that could have happened by gravity or by something manually pushing it or rolling it up that femur. That freaked us out. Like, we were like, "Did you see that?" And he was like, "Yeah, I saw it, man." And I was like, "What did you see?" He was like, "Well, I saw that piece of muscle roll up the leg." So in that moment, he was looking up, like up to the ceiling, and you could feel that there was somebody in there. And we started praying, and we were like, "If you're here," when we're talking about the person who we were harvesting the tissue from, we said a prayer and we told him, like, "You're on the other side now. Please go towards the light and, rest." And within a few minutes after saying that prayer, we didn't feel anything anymore in the operating room. Like, it was that feeling that somebody else was there, basically disappeared. I must have performed about 600 to 650 organ and tissue and cornea surgeries to recover the donated gifts for transplant. And I worked so much that it started affecting my physical health and my mental health. So at one time I was working 3 jobs. I was a full-time teacher for high school teaching science, and I was working these 2 jobs for the organ and tissue harvesting industry. At the time, I was living on nicotine and caffeine. And to me, it was always an adrenaline rush because each case was different. And I literally saw every type of death that a human could experience. And pretty much from the age of 12, that was my youngest, to, of course, like your 83-year-olds and everything in between. So there were many times where I remember doing surgery to surgically harvest tissues from somebody who had just been murdered. I remember one stands out to me very clearly. He had been stabbed by his roommate with a large kitchen knife. Both of them were drunk, and I guess they had an argument. So one guy ended up stabbing the other. I went down to the morgue because I was the first one to arrive, and the security, he was like, "Oh yeah, the body's right there," and then he left. And that morgue was always creepy. Like, it was an old morgue, and the smell was just disgusting. Eventually, you get used to it, but it wasn't a sanitary morgue, and you could always feel that there was a heaviness in the air. So I opened up the body bag. The first thing that I saw was all these stab wounds on his abdominal region and his chest cavity. And some of those wounds, his intestines were actually coming out. So I was like, wow, like whoever killed him must have been really upset. So I ended up doing a quick physical assessment. I called my boss and we both agreed, yeah, we can still harvest some tissue. So I went back to the emergency room to talk to the charge nurse. And I was like, man, whoever killed that guy he must have been really pissed at him. She was like, oh, you want to see who murdered him? And I was like, well, yeah, sure. And she was like, turn around. And sure enough, the guy who murdered him, his roommate, was sitting on an emergent, one of those ambulance stretchers, and he was cuffed to it. And he was smiling and talking like a normal person with the EMT techs. And he looked at me, and for a few seconds we kind of locked eyes, and he just was smiling like he knew what he did and he didn't care. And he turned back around and he just started talking with the guys again. 2 hours later, we had the body in the operating room, and I'm over here cutting him up, basically dismembering the body. And I remember thinking to myself, like, wow, I'm dismembering a person who was just murdered. Like, that's crazy. And I started wondering, like, am I doing wrong by performing these surgeries on these bodies? Like, am I doing God's work to help other people, or is this a sin? I always thought, I'm helping people. This is gonna rack up some points so that when I pass away, I'll get in heaven because I'm serving others with my skills and my gift of, the human body, anatomy, and physiology. But there were, suicides, like gunshots to the head where half the skull was missing. The brains were not there anymore. Gunshots to the chest, vehicle accidents where limbs were torn off, motorcycle accidents that were just, man, they were brutal. And those stand out. I remember literally picking up arms from the body bag that were detached from the body. And it was like, so clean, the wound from separating from the shoulder. Like, it was better than a surgeon could perform that surgery. It was just so clean. And well, of course, with that trauma, the impact, would break their neck and, peel off skin from the legs or the arms. Like, it was very brutal. So the more surgeries I did and performed, the more sleep I would lose. Slowly, I started having these episodes where when I would close my eyes, like if I was, drifting off for a nap or drifting off to sleep, I started seeing things as I would close my eyes. I would see faces of demons, that were morphing in and out of the darkness. When you close your eyes, you can see that black curtain, and then the redness. Sometimes you can see it, and the faces would come out from the dark, and you would see them kind of morph the face of a demon to like a dragon, and then back to a different face of a demon. And it made me afraid to literally go to sleep, and there was no way I could control it. So Not only was I getting sleep deprived from work, but I was being sleep deprived because I was afraid to go to sleep, because it never failed that every time I would try and get some sleep, I'd start seeing these faces. And I knew that, you know what? I've had paranormal experiences all my life. This job is basically allowing these spirits to potentially latch onto me, good and bad spirits. It's something that I kept in mind. I just kept moving forward. Shortly after that incident, probably the weirdest experience that I had, and it happened for roughly about 2 years. When I would be lying down, my arms, my legs, maybe it would be like one leg that would just picture somebody picking up your foot and pulling it. That kind of action was my leg. And it would happen sporadically, suddenly, and it would startle me. It would wake me up, and I would look in the room, and of course there was nobody there. There were also other times where I would be sleeping and all of a sudden my arm would rise up. I started paying attention, and I was wondering, well, is it just a reflex that I'm doing? The more I paid attention to what was happening, I noticed that there was no muscle action. There was no muscle activity in my shoulders or in my thigh that was causing these limbs to be rising and to be pulled. That happened for a long time, to the point where my current girlfriend, when I met her, we started, sleeping together, and she was the one that told me, she was like, you're twitching a lot when you're sleeping. And I'm like, what do you mean twitching? And she was like, yeah, like your leg will suddenly, rise up, and like if somebody's pulling it, or your arm will suddenly, be pulled up, like if somebody's pulling it. She goes, but the weirdest thing is that you're appearing to be punched in the stomach at night, because you make the sound like if somebody's taking your wind out with a punch, and your stomach actually goes in. And I was like, yeah, right. Like, I can believe that my leg and arm is doing that because I've experienced it while I'm awake. But being punched in the gut, that's something different. So I was like, you know what? I'll pay more attention, next time. And sure enough, I started feeling it. It would happen randomly, to where all of a sudden, boom, like it felt like somebody hit me in my stomach, and the air would be knocked out. That was weird. So we started, doing some prayers, and there was a couple of days where I stopped feeling that sensation, that gut punch. But then she started experiencing that same gut punch feeling. So it was kind of like that spirit transferred over to her, and she started having that gut punch happen to her. And I could see her stomach literally be pushed, kind of like if she was being punched. Her stomach would go in and her breath would come out. She would make that noise, like if she had been punched in the stomach, and I would wake her up, and I'm like, hey, like this happening to you now. And she was like, yeah, right. And I'm like, no, seriously, like it's happening to you. And I asked her, look, if I start talking in my sleep, record me if you can. And she was like, okay, I'll record you. She tells me that there were times where I would get home from work and I would, be on the couch. I would drift off to sleep, but I started talking to random people. And of course, I had no memory of it, but she was saying that I was talking to people from my previous career. In my early 20s, I did some private, contracting work for some government agencies, and I did perform certain things that were in the interest of national security and basically putting bad people away. So I wasn't proud of some of the things I did, but there were not too many people that could perform the job, and I was one of them. So I did. But she started telling me about some of the conversations I was having with people while I was asleep, and it was like Yeah, I remember that incident, and it was just weird. Like the talking in my sleep wasn't that scary. It was just more like, oh, okay, it's probably associated with sleep deprivation, not a big deal. The later on, probably about a month later, we started noticing things that were being moved around the apartment by themselves. Like there would be times where I would place my keys on the kitchen counter, and the next morning they were nowhere to be found. And then we would see them in the living room on the lamp table, and I would ask her like, "Hey, did you move my keys last night, or did you go anywhere and use my truck?" And she was like, "No, I didn't. Like, I was here next to you the whole night." And I'm like, "Well, I left my keys on the kitchen counter, and now they're in the living room. Like, I know I didn't get up to move them because I didn't work last night." And there were also times where you would hear footsteps in the apartment while we were in bed, trying to go to sleep. You would hear the shuffling of feet, and sometimes you would hear the kitchen cabinets close and open by themselves. And there was one time where I heard somebody or something knock on the door so very loud, like it woke both of us up. And I remember as soon as I heard it, I remember just getting up and running to the front because I thought it was somebody trying to break in. And I remember I had my gun with me, my handgun, a Glock, and I opened the door and there was nobody there. It was like 3:30 in the morning, and I asked her, I go, "Did you hear that?" And she was like, "Yeah, like somebody knocked on the door really loud." I'm like, "Man, there's nobody outside." And she was like, "Well, I don't know. Like that was kind of weird." That was kind of weird, but all these experiences made me think about, okay, what is the purpose of being so sensitive to the paranormal and the spiritual entities? To this day, I can't figure it out, but I know for a fact that my job and my time working in the organ and tissue transplant did something to open up some doors or like a portal to where I'm now very sensitive to things around me. It could be spirits, it could be energy from somebody. I'm able to tell a lot from a person just by being around them for a couple of minutes and kind of feeling their energies. Getting back to when I was recovering the corneas from the eyes, the saying of the eyes are the window to the soul is so true. I mean, that is absolute truth, because there were times like the story I mentioned where that person that man who died, there was a lot of anger, and it was like an evil entity that had been living inside him that transferred to me. There was also people that were good people during the life, and you could sense that calm, warm presence when you were around their body and performing these surgeries. So there was good and bad, but the bad were more pronounced, and they affected me much more than the good spirits, or the good entities, I should say. It was in 2021, the summer of 2021. I ended up accepting a job 5 hours away from my hometown. So I ended up quitting those two jobs, and I picked up another job that paid more, and it was in the same organ and tissue industry. And it was good. I moved up. I was living with my girlfriend, and, of course the work was 10 times busier. So I was losing that much more sleep. That being said, I started experiencing much more of the paranormal stuff, to where the leg and the arms being picked up, or the stomach, the gut punch being pushed. I remember there were times where I was walking through the living room or through the kitchen, and I would feel that just suddenly, like if somebody pushed me from behind or somebody pushed me from the front, like it was real. Like I wasn't making it up. I wasn't hallucinating. And I could tell, like, okay, it's probably a spirit that I picked up at the morgue or at the operating room. So I would do a lot of prayer, And, for the most part, it helped get the spirits, away from me. But there were times where in my sleep, I would see these spirits. And to this day, I am a firm believer that there is no way that my brain and my mind could make up such images of these spirits, these demons, because they were always morphing and they were so detailed and so evil looking that it would wake me up and I would be drenched in sweat. There was a lot of times where my girlfriend would shake me awake. She was like, "Hey, you're sweating." She was the whole side of your bed is wet in sweat. Like, what's going on? Are you sick? And I was like, no, I was having a dream again. I ended up confiding in her to what was happening, and she kind of understood, okay, so this is what's going on. And I was like, yeah, like I need to get out of this field because it's destroying me. I wasn't enjoying it anymore. And the spirits that were attached to me were causing me not only physical and mental harm, but spiritual harm too. I ended up quitting that job on the spot one day. I hadn't been feeling well for a couple of days and I was off work. That day that I went back to work, I had 7 surgeries lined up and I was only able to do 1 surgery. And at that point, I just couldn't do it anymore. So I called my boss. I explained what was going on. And I said, I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. He really had a hard time believing that I was quitting on the spot. And, he was offering me, well, just do 1 more surgery and then take the day off. I'm like, no, I'm serious. Like, I'm done. Like, I quit. And that was it.
If you've had a paranormal experience and would like to be a guest on the show, please contact us by going to myparax.com. That's myparaex.com. Thanks for listening.